Welcome back to the Bronco Nation, your place for all things Ford Bronco. Today, we're here at the Dirt Tires and Donuts garage, getting our Bronco ready for some 35-inch tires. Now, to see under the Bronco better, we're gonna put the Bronco in the air with a lift, but you could easily do this with your Bronco on jack stands. For this lift, we're gonna remove the skid plates and the sway bar to give us better access to removing the front shocks. First, loosen the two lower bolts and remove the two upper bolts from the front skid plate. Then remove the two lower bolts on the middle skid plate and move the skid plate out of the way. Then loosen the four bolts on the third skid plate and move this skid plate out of the way. This is going to expose the sway bar assembly. To remove the sway bar, first unclip the 5 plastic clips holding the wire harness in place. This is hard to see with the sway bar under the Bronco, so with it on the floor, you can see the 5 clips better. 4 are on the wire harness and the 5th clip is on the connector. Then, back under the Bronco, disconnect the wire harness at the connector. Then, remove the sway bar from the control arm. If the bolt just spins, grab a T40 hex socket to hold the bolt while loosening the nut and repeat this on the other side. Then remove the 4 remaining nuts and lower the sway bar assembly out from under the Bronco. Now, before you remove your lower control arms, you're going to want to mark your cam bolts. And this is because this is how your Bronco stays in alignment, is through these cam bolts. And what you're gonna wanna do is just take a paint pen or something to mark them so that when you're putting it back together, you have a general idea of how it should all go back together. Now, you're going to have to do an alignment with this because you're changing the geometry of your Bronco, you're changing things around, but this will help you get close so you can actually drive it to an alignment shop after you're done with this. Now, the next part is going to be removing this lower control arm and kind of letting it hang so that we can pull the shock and spring out. With your cam bolts marked, first remove the tie rod from the knuckle. With the nut loose, hit the knuckle with a brass hammer on the side of the knuckle to try and knock the tapered stud loose. If you do end up hitting the stud, leave the nut on and hit it with a brass hammer, being careful not to crush the threads. Then remove the 2 bottom nuts on the lower control arm. With those removed, remove the 2 cam bolts. The bolt head size is 21 millimeters, while the nut on the back side is 24 millimeters. With the cam bolts out, carefully lower the control arm down and separate it from the coilover. Then remove the 3 upper coilover bolts and remove the coilover assembly. All right, so we just got our shock assembly, our strut assembly here out of the Bronco, and we're gonna install a shock collar lift. And this is gonna keep our factory coilover length, but still let us achieve the 2.5 inches of lift.
This is factory spec. This is your limiting factor in your suspension for droop. In other words, your down travel. And when you use a collar, you're just changing your spring tension, the spring rate, which achieves lift because it adds preload to this spring.
Now that we have the coilovers out, we're gonna add the collars on them. To do this, we'll be using a spring compressor. If you don't have a spring compressor, you can take your coilovers to an off-road shop to add the collar on for you. Using the spring compressor, release the spring tension and remove the top bolt and separate the shock out from the spring. Then, with a rubber mallet, hammer off the spring perch. Slide the lift collar over the strut, then slide back on the spring perch, bushing, and the shock cap. Hammer the cap in place and slide the shock body back through the coil spring. Replace the coilover cap and nut and tighten them back down.
All right, so we're about to put the coilover back under the Bronco, and what I'm gonna do, it's kind of hard to see up there, I'm gonna just put it in and hold it with one of the nuts that will go on there, and then I will reconnect everything down at the bottom and then tighten the nuts on the top.
If your tie rod is spinning while you're trying to tighten it back down, you can hold the bolt with an 8mm socket while you tighten the nut down. With the sway bar and skid plates back in place, we'll move to the rear coilovers. First, start by removing the plastic clips holding the inner fender liner in place. Then, remove the inner fender liner. With the liner removed, you'll have access to the coilover top bolts. Remove these 3 top bolts. Then, with the rear axle supported with jack stands, remove the lower strut bolt and remove the coilover. Then, repeat the same process as the front shocks to install the lift collar. With the lift collar installed, reinstall the rear coilover and the inner fender liner.
So that's it. Now we are ready for our 35-inch tires. Right now it looks like Bronco skipped leg day, but it's going to look fantastic. Now, if you're doing this, a couple things. You want to make sure that you get an alignment done after you do this, and if you're upgrading your tires, which I would recommend, then you want to do an alignment after you have put your new wheels and tires on. Now, the second thing, you saw Garrett using that spring compressor. Now, I don't have one of these in my garage, you probably don't either. So what you could do is you could take your coilover to a off-road shop or somewhere like that, and they could install them for you for way cheaper. Or you could pick a spring compressor up from Harbor Freight or something like that. I wouldn't recommend getting those kind of screw-on, clamp-on spring compressors. Those are like death waiting to happen. Hopefully that was helpful for you guys. A huge thank you to Dirt Tires and Donuts. Garrett is awesome. And if you're looking for this kit, check the link in the description below. We'll put a link to where you can get one of these down below. And hey, if you haven't yet, make sure to head over to the bronconation.com where you can check all the Bronco news, join the community, and shop some cool Bronco swag. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.